The general's steel-gray eyes held nothing but contempt as he gestured toward the ancient military lockbox sitting on the mahogany conference table. $1 million to anyone who can crack it, he announced to the room full of investors, his voice dripping with arrogance. This baby survived 2 wars and 50 years of attempted break-ins by the military's best cryptographers. He smirked at the janitor quietly emptying trash bins in the corner. Hell, I'll even let the cleaning staff take a shot. The room erupted in laughter, wealthy men in expensive suits finding humor in the absurdity. But Marcus Chen didn't laugh. The 62-year-old maintenance worker froze mid-motion, his weathered hands gripping the garbage bag tighter as his eyes locked onto the lockbox. His breath caught. He knew that specific model, knew the unique scratches along its edges, knew the faded serial number barely visible on its side. He'd seen it before, in another life, in another war. When he was Captain Marcus Chen, EOD specialist, before everything fell apart, before the incident that stripped him of his rank, his career, his entire identity. The general had no idea he'd just challenged a ghost to open his own grave. The Whitmore Defense Contractors boardroom buzzed with the energy of $40 million in potential contracts hanging in the air. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the Pentagon across the Potomac, while portraits of military heroes lined the mahogany-paneled walls. At the head of the polished table sat General Robert Iron Horse Morrison, retired but still carrying himself with the rigid bearing of a man accustomed to absolute authority. At 68, his silver hair remained regulation short, his uniform-pressed civilian suit impeccable despite retirement. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Morrison had built Morrison Security Solutions into a $300 million empire by trading on his military reputation and his collection of impossible challenges that impressed corporate clients. The lockbox was his crown jewel, a genuine World War II German Enigma variant that had stumped everyone from MIT professors to NSA codebreakers. He'd acquired it through military surplus channels 20 years ago, and it had become his signature party trick. No one had ever come close to opening it. "Gentlemen," Morrison continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded thousands of soldiers, "this lockbox contains documents that could revolutionize modern battlefield communications. The bidding for the Morrison contract starts at $20 million, but first," he patted the metal box affectionately, "let's see if anyone here has what it takes to earn that $1 million bonus." Around the table, defense contractors leaned forward with interest. These were men who built missiles and tanks, who understood that Morrison's challenges were really elaborate demonstrations of his tactical thinking. Getting the contract meant more than money. It meant access to Pentagon connections worth hundreds of millions in future deals. Marcus Chen continued his work invisibly, the way he'd learned to move through the world for the past 15 years. Gray workshirt, fabric softened from countless washings, steel-toed boots that had walked thousands of miles across marble floors and industrial carpeting. At 62, he carried himself with careful economy of movement, each step deliberate, each gesture precise. People saw the janitor's uniform and stopped seeing the man. They had no idea that the hands now emptying their wastebaskets had once diffused improvised explosives in Fallujah, had rewired communication systems under enemy fire in Afghanistan, had been steady enough to perform microsurgery on devices designed to kill. The lockbox sat 18 inches away from him, its brass fittings tarnished with age, its steel case bearing the particular scratches he remembered from a bunker outside Kandahar in 2007. He'd spent 3 days working on an identical unit, mapping its internal mechanisms, understanding its creator's mind. The German engineer who designed it had built in 17 different fail-safes, but also, if you understood the pattern, a master bypass that could be triggered through a specific sequence of manipulations. "Come now," Morrison called out, his voice cutting through Marcus's memories. "Surely someone here has the backbone to try. What about you, Henderson?" He gestured toward a thin man in wire-rimmed glasses. "Your company just landed the submarine contract. Feeling lucky?" David Henderson, CEO of Atlantic Maritime Defense, shifted uncomfortably. These corporate theater moments made him nervous, but Morrison's approval was worth $50 million in annual contracts. He stood, loosened his tie slightly, and approached the lockbox. Marcus watched from the corner, recognizing the amateur's approach immediately. Henderson ran his fingers over the surface randomly, pressed buttons without understanding their function, twisted dials in simple sequential patterns. It was the approach of someone who'd seen too many movies, who thought complexity could be defeated through trial and error. The mechanism has over 2 million possible combinations, Morrison explained to the room, clearly enjoying Henderson's increasingly frustrated efforts. Even with modern computers, a brute force attack would take decades. You need to think like the engineer who designed it, understand his psychology, his cultural references, his mathematical preferences. Henderson gave up after 10 minutes, returning to his seat with visible relief. 2 other executives followed, each bringing their own approach. One tried to find hidden panels, another attempted to analyze the scratches for clues. All failed within minutes, confirming Morrison's superiority in front of the room. "Perhaps," Morrison said, his tone shifting to mock generosity, "we should give our maintenance friend here a chance. After all, he's been watching closely." The general's smile was predatory. "What do you say, what's your name, son?" Marcus straightened slowly, meeting Morrison's gaze for the first time. "Marcus Chen, sir." "Well, Marcus Chen, care to make yourself a millionaire today?" Morrison's voice carried the particular cruelty of someone who enjoyed humiliating people he considered beneath him. "I promise the gentleman here won't mind if you get your working-class fingerprints on their precious lockbox." The room chuckled again, but Marcus noticed something else in their faces, a hunger to see someone fail, to confirm their own superiority. These men had built fortunes on other people's work, on government contracts that turned taxpayer money into private jets and vacation homes. They needed to believe that intelligence and worth were measured by bank account balances. "You don't have to," called out a voice from across the room. Elizabeth Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Defense Contractors, spoke from her position by the windows. At 38, she commanded the room's respect through competence rather than bluster, having transformed her father's struggling company into Morrison's biggest competitor. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a professional bun, her navy blue suit tailored, but not ostentatious. Unlike the others, she wasn't smiling. "General Morrison, the man is working. This isn't part of his job description." Morrison's face darkened. Elizabeth Whitmore was the one person in the room who could challenge him directly. Her company's Pentagon connections rivaled his own. "Of course, Ms. Whitmore, always protecting the working class. How refreshingly progressive of you." The tension between them was familiar to everyone present. Morrison represented old military hierarchy, while Elizabeth had built her success on innovation and treating employees as assets rather than disposable resources. Their companies competed for the same contracts, but their philosophies couldn't be more different. Marcus looked between them, understanding the dynamics at play. Elizabeth's intervention wasn't really about protecting him. It was about not giving Morrison another opportunity to demonstrate dominance. But her consideration touched something in him that had been dormant for years, a reminder of officers who'd actually cared about their soldiers' welfare. "It's all right, ma'am," Marcus said quietly. "I don't mind taking a look." He approached the table slowly, aware that every eye in the room was now focused on him. The lockbox seemed to grow larger as he got closer, its familiar weight and dimensions pulling him back through time. He could almost smell the desert sand, feel the pressure of sniper scopes tracking his movement as he'd worked on its twin in that bunker so many years ago. Morrison leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, supremely confident. "Take your time, Marcus. No pressure. Just $1 million in the respect of some of the most powerful men in defense contracting." Marcus circled the lockbox once, his practiced eye cataloging details that others had missed. The scratches weren't random. They formed a pattern, coordinates that meant something to someone who understood military grid references. The serial number wasn't faded by age. It had been deliberately abraded to hide specific digits. And the brass fittings, tarnished as they were, showed wear patterns that revealed which elements had been manipulated most frequently. He'd learned to read these signs in Iraq, when a single misunderstood detail meant the difference between defusing a device and creating a crater. The German engineer who'd designed this system hadn't just built a lock, he'd built a test of military intelligence, a puzzle that required understanding of Wehrmacht operational procedures and Nazi cryptographic philosophy. The designer was probably Wehrmacht signals intelligence, Marcus said quietly, more to himself than to the room. Based on the internal configuration, I'd guess this was built between 1942 and 1944. The mathematical progression follows Enigma principles, but with physical rather than electrical switching. Morrison's confident expression flickered slightly. Lucky guess. Anyone could look up that information. But Marcus wasn't finished with his analysis. He ran his fingers along the edges, feeling for pressure points that weren't visible to the naked eye. The master reset is triggered by replicating the German military time system. 24-hour clock, but reference to Berlin mean time, not Greenwich. And the sequence, he paused, memory flooding back. The sequence is based on Wehrmacht daily code changes, using the operator's birthday as the mathematical key. The room had gone completely silent. Even Morrison's smug expression was beginning to crack. "Whose birthday?" Elizabeth asked, her voice cutting through the tension. Marcus smiled grimly, his fingers finding the first sequence point. "The engineer's daughter, born June 15, 1926. He hid her birthday in the mechanism as a way to remember her while he was building weapons for a regime that would eventually kill her." He began to work, his movements precise and economical. First dial clockwise to 6, representing June. Then, a combination of physical pressure and rotational movement that replicated the Wehrmacht's daily authentication protocol. The mechanism clicked softly, internal gears engaging in a sequence that hadn't been activated in decades. Morrison leaned forward, his confidence evaporating. "How could you possibly know that?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. His hands were moving with muscle memory now, following procedures he'd learned from an old German engineer in a refugee camp outside Baghdad. The man had been in his 80s, a former Wehrmacht signal specialist who'd spent 50 years trying to forget the machines he'd built. But in the chaos of war, when Marcus's unit had needed to crack a cache of similar devices, the old man had finally shared his knowledge. "Because," Marcus said as the lock's internal mechanisms continued to respond to his manipulations, "I met the engineer's son in Iraq, Hermann Kruger. He was a refugee, but he remembered his father's work, remembered the stories about the daughter who died in Auschwitz, and how her memory was hidden in every device his father built." The second sequence engaged, then the third. Marcus worked with growing confidence, each successful step confirming his understanding of the system. Around him, the room remained frozen in disbelief. These powerful men, accustomed to controlling every situation, watched helplessly as their assumptions about intelligence and capability crumbled. "This is impossible," Morrison whispered. "The NSA spent 6 months on this device. MIT had it for a year. How can you—" The final sequence clicked into place. The lockbox's lid opened with a soft mechanical sigh, revealing the documents inside. Marcus stepped back, his hands shaking slightly from adrenaline and memory. For a moment, he was Captain Chen again, successfully defusing another device, saving another unit from destruction. Then, reality crashed back, and he was just the janitor who'd somehow opened the impossible lock. Morrison stared at the open box as if it had personally betrayed him. His face cycled through confusion, anger, and something approaching panic. The lockbox had been his signature demonstration for 20 years, proof of his tactical superiority. Its defeat by a maintenance worker threatened everything he'd built his reputation on. "There must be a trick," Morrison said, his voice hollow. "You had to have seen this specific model before. There's no other explanation." "I did see it before," Marcus replied quietly. "In Kandahar, in 2007. My unit found a cache of them in a Taliban weapons depot, German World War II surplus that had somehow made its way to Afghanistan." He met Morrison's stare steadily. "I spent 3 days learning how they worked because understanding your enemy's tools is the difference between living and dying." Elizabeth Whitmore moved closer to the table, her expression unreadable. "What was your unit, Mr. Chen?" "3rd Armored Division, 82nd Engineer Battalion," Marcus replied automatically. "EOD Specialist, rank of Captain." Then, more quietly, until 2008. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in that room understood military hierarchy, understood what it meant to reach captain rank in an EOD unit. Explosive ordnance disposal specialists were among the military's elite, soldiers who required years of training and nerves that couldn't be broken under pressure. They weren't the kind of people who became maintenance workers unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. Morrison's face had gone pale. "Captain, what happened to your career, soldier?" Marcus's jaw tightened, old pain flickering across his features. "I made a mistake, sir. People died because of my judgment call. The Army decided I was no longer fit for command." But Elizabeth Whitmore was studying him with different eyes now, seeing past the janitor's uniform to the man underneath. What kind of mistake causes a decorated EOD specialist to end up working maintenance for 15 years? Before Marcus could answer, Morrison stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This is ridiculous. I don't care what this man's military background might have been. The fact remains that he's currently employed as custodial staff, and I don't appreciate being made a fool of in my own boardroom." "Your boardroom?" Elizabeth's voice was sharp. "This is Whitmore Defense Contractors, General. You're a guest here, and you just offered $1 million to anyone who could open that lock. Mr. Chen succeeded where your vaunted experts failed. Honor your word." The room erupted in murmured conversations as the contractors sensed blood in the water. Morrison's humiliation was their entertainment, but more importantly, it represented a shift in power dynamics. If the great General Morrison could be defeated by a janitor, what did that say about his other claims of superiority? Morrison's face darkened with rage. "I'm not paying $1 million to some washed-up soldier who got lucky. This was obviously rigged somehow. He must have had access to the box beforehand, or you underestimated him," Elizabeth interrupted coldly. "Just like you underestimate everyone you consider beneath your notice." Marcus found himself caught between them, understanding that this confrontation was about more than the lockbox or the money. These were two competing visions of power, Morrison's based on hierarchy and intimidation, Elizabeth's based on recognizing value regardless of its packaging. "Ma'am," Marcus said quietly, "I don't need the money. I was just curious about the mechanism." Elizabeth turned to him, her expression softening slightly. "Mr. Chen, you earned that money through knowledge and skill. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." But Morrison wasn't finished. "Fine. You want your $1 million? Let's see what a real challenge looks like." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a second device, this one sleeker and more modern. "This is a current generation NSA crypto lock, military grade, 21st century. No Nazi engineers or refugee camp stories to help you here. Crack this one, and I'll double the bet, $2 million. Marcus looked at the new device and felt his stomach drop. He recognized it immediately, not the specific model, but the manufacturer, the design philosophy, the particular arrangement of access points. It was a Whitmore defense product, one of the newer generation security systems that had earned Elizabeth's company its Pentagon contracts. "That's enough." Elizabeth's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "General Morrison, you've already been proven wrong once today. Demanding a second demonstration isn't saving your dignity, it's destroying it." But Marcus stepped forward, studying the new device with professional interest. "It's all right, ma'am, I know this model." Elizabeth's eyes widened in surprise. "You know Whitmore crypto locks?" Marcus nodded slowly. "I helped design the original specifications back when I was still consulting privately after my military discharge. Your father's company hired me for 3 months in 2009 to develop the internal security protocols." The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Elizabeth stared at Marcus with new understanding, pieces of a puzzle falling into place in her mind. Morrison's face went through several shades of color as he realized the trap he'd just walked into. "You worked for Whitmore Defense?" Morrison's voice was barely a whisper. "Contract consultant," Marcus confirmed. "I designed the master override sequence and the encryption hierarchy. Your NSA device is probably running version 4.2 of my original security architecture." Elizabeth sank into the nearest chair, her mind racing. "Marcus Chen. Chen Brandt Security Solutions. You're MC Chen Brandt." Marcus nodded, old shame creeping into his expression. I was. Before the company collapsed, before the lawsuits, before everything fell apart. Now I'm just Marcus Chen, and I clean offices for a living. The name Chen Brandt Security Solutions sent ripples of recognition around the room. It had been legendary in defense contracting circles, a boutique firm that had revolutionized military encryption and security protocols before disappearing almost overnight in 2010. Industry rumors had suggested everything from corporate espionage to criminal negligence, but no one had ever learned the true story. Morrison stared at Marcus as if seeing a ghost. You're supposed to be dead. The military report said whatever was convenient at the time, Marcus interrupted, his voice hardening. Just like they always do when someone becomes inconvenient. Elizabeth stood slowly, her business mind processing the implications at lightning speed. Marcus Chen hadn't just been a consultant to her father's company. His work had been the foundation for their most successful product lines. The crypto locks, the communication systems, the battlefield networks that had made Whitmore Defense a major Pentagon contractor. All of it had grown from innovations that Marcus had developed during his brief time with them. Mr. Chen, she said carefully, I think we need to talk. Privately. But Morrison wasn't ready to retreat. His pride, his reputation, everything he'd built, his post-military career was crashing down around him. This is all very touching, but it doesn't change the facts. This man is a maintenance worker now, not some brilliant engineer. People don't fall that far without good reason. Marcus's hands clenched into fists, 15 years of buried anger finally surfacing. You want to know the good reason, General? I made a command decision that saved a school full of children but cost the lives of 2 soldiers under my command. The investigation concluded that I violated protocols, that I should have followed standard procedure even if it meant letting the kids die. So they court-martialed me, stripped my rank, and destroyed my career as an example to other officers about the importance of following orders. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone present. These men understood military hierarchy, understood the impossible choices that combat commanders sometimes faced. They also understood how easily the system could destroy someone who made unpopular decisions, regardless of their moral justification. Elizabeth felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition of injustice that connected to her own struggles in the male-dominated defense industry. What happened after your discharge? Marcus's voice became flat, emotionless. I tried to rebuild, started the consulting company, did good work for 5 years. Then, the Pentagon decided that having a court-martialed officer working on classified projects was bad optics. They pressured my clients to drop my contracts, threatened to review security clearances for anyone who employed me. Within 6 months, I was blacklisted from every defense contractor in the country. And your company? Collapsed under lawsuits and debt. My business partner committed suicide. My wife left me and took our daughter. I lost the house, lost everything. Marcus's gaze fixed on the crypto lock in front of him. So, yes, General Morrison, people can fall very far indeed when the system decides they're expendable. Morrison opened his mouth to respond, but Elizabeth cut him off. General, I think this meeting is over. Security will escort you and your associates out. You can't be serious. The Morrison contract is worth $40 million to your company. Elizabeth's smile was cold as winter steel. General, you just spent the last hour humiliating and degrading one of the most brilliant security engineers in military history, a man whose work has probably saved thousands of lives. You offered money you refused to pay, made bets you can't honor, and demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership that gets good soldiers killed. She stood, moving to Marcus's side. The Morrison contract isn't worth compromising our integrity. Consider our business relationship terminated. As security guards began escorting the sputtering Morrison and his associates from the building, Elizabeth turned back to Marcus. The janitor who had opened the impossible lock was studying the crypto device with the focused attention of someone solving a complex puzzle. Mr. Chen, she said quietly, would you be interested in having lunch? I think there are some things we should discuss. Marcus looked up at her, seeing something in her eyes that he hadn't encountered in 15 years, Respect. Not pity, not charity, but genuine recognition of his worth as a professional and a human being. "I'd like that, ma'am," he replied, "but I should probably finish emptying the trash cans first." Elizabeth laughed, the sound breaking the tension that had dominated the room for the past hour. "Mr. Chen, I have a feeling that your days of emptying trash cans might be coming to an end." As they walked toward the elevator together, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had just shifted in his life. For 15 years he'd been invisible, written off, relegated to the margins of a world he'd once helped protect. But today, in opening that lock, he'd cracked something else, the prison of assumptions that had kept him trapped in a life smaller than his talents deserved. The lockbox sat forgotten on the conference table, its secrets finally revealed, its purpose served. But the real revelation was just beginning. The executive dining room on the 42nd floor of Whitmore Defense Contractors offered a panoramic view of the Potomac River, but Marcus Chen found himself studying his reflection in the polished mahogany table instead. Across from him, Elizabeth Whitmore sat with a half-eaten Caesar salad, her attention focused entirely on the file folder she'd been reading for the past 20 minutes. "Exemplary service record," she said quietly, turning another page. "Bronze Star, Purple Heart, 2 commendations for valor under fire. Graduated top 5% from EOD school, advanced training at Aberdeen Proving Ground." She looked up at him. "Your military personnel file reads like a recruiting poster, Mr. Chen, right up until March 15th, 2008. Marcus set down his coffee cup, the ceramic clicking against the saucer with finality. That's when everything changed. Elizabeth closed the file and leaned back in her chair. Through her assistant's Pentagon connections, she'd managed to access Marcus's complete military record in less than 2 hours. What she'd found there didn't match the broken man narrative that Morrison had tried to create downstairs. Instead, she'd discovered a soldier whose tactical brilliance and moral courage had made him legendary among his peers, until one terrible day when those same qualities had destroyed him. "Tell me about Kandahar," she said. "Tell me about the school." Marcus's eyes grew distant, pulled back to a dusty compound outside the city where the temperature had hit 115 degrees and the air had smelled of diesel fuel and fear. Intelligence reported a possible IED factory in an abandoned building. Standard sweep and clear operation. But when we got there, he paused, his hands unconsciously moving to trace patterns on the table. It wasn't abandoned. It was a school. 63 children, ages 5 to 12, and 3 teachers who'd been trying to give those kids some kind of normal life in the middle of a war zone. Elizabeth waited, understanding that some stories could only be told at their own pace. "The building was wired," Marcus continued. "Professional job, whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. Multiple devices, redundant triggers, designed to bring down the entire structure if anyone tried to defuse them incorrectly. Standard protocol was to evacuate everyone and call in a controlled detonation team. But you didn't follow protocol. The evacuation routes were compromised. Taliban had positioned snipers in the surrounding buildings, probably planning to pick off the kids as they ran, and the controlled detonation team was 6 hours out minimum." Marcus's voice hardened. Those children would have been sitting targets, or they would have been blown up with the building. Either way, they'd be dead. Elizabeth found herself leaning forward, captured by the impossible choice he'd faced. "What did you do?" "I made a command decision, sent Sergeants Rodriguez and Kim to establish overwatch positions while I went in alone to defuse the devices. If I screwed up, at least the blast would be contained to the building and only take me with it." He met her eyes, and she saw the weight of old guilt there. But the Taliban weren't just planning to kill children, they were planning to kill the American soldiers who would try to save them. The overwatch positions I'd chosen were pre-targeted. Rodriguez and Kim walked into a crossfire. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the understanding of sacrifice and loss. Elizabeth had read the official reports, had seen the clinical language that reduced human tragedy to strategic assessments and procedural violations. But hearing it from Marcus, seeing the pain still etched in his features. 15 years later, she understood why his superiors had been so eager to destroy him. He'd saved 63 innocent lives by sacrificing 2 good soldiers, and in the military's rigid moral calculus, that made him a problem to be eliminated. The investigation concluded that you violated direct orders, Elizabeth said softly. I was ordered to wait for backup, to follow evacuation protocols, to treat the safety of American personnel as the primary objective. Marcus's laugh was bitter. The fact that I saved those children was irrelevant to the court-martial. What mattered was that I'd made an independent tactical decision that resulted in American casualties. The Pentagon needed to send a message about the importance of following orders, regardless of circumstances. Elizabeth set down her fork, her appetite gone. She'd spent her entire career in the defense industry, had built her company's success on military contracts and Pentagon relationships, but she'd always managed to maintain some distance from the human cost of warfare, treating it as an abstract necessity rather than a personal reality. Marcus's story stripped away that comfortable abstraction, forcing her to confront the moral complexity of a system she'd profited from for decades. What happened to the children? They grew up, Marcus said simply. Some of them are probably adults now, with children of their own. I get letters sometimes, translated through refugee organizations. They remember the American soldier who crawled through their school and cut the wires that would have killed them. They don't know that same soldier was destroyed by his own country for making that choice. Elizabeth felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition of injustice that connected to her own struggles as a woman in the male-dominated defense industry. She'd faced discrimination and dismissal, had been written off by men who couldn't see past her gender to recognize her capabilities. But her struggles paled in comparison to what Marcus had endured, 15 years of exile, of being treated as if his sacrifice and expertise were worthless simply because he'd chosen to save children over following orders. After your discharge, you started Chen Brandt Security Solutions. Marcus nodded, his expression brightening slightly. David Brandt was my business partner, former NSA cryptographer who'd left government service to go private. We'd worked together in Afghanistan on some joint operations, and he believed that my tactical experience combined with his technical background could revolutionize military security systems. For 5 years, we were right. Elizabeth pulled out a second file, this one containing her father's business records from 2009. You consulted for Whitmore Defense for 3 months. The crypto lock systems, the battlefield communication networks, the intrusion detection protocols, all of those grew out of innovations you developed during that period. Your father was a good man to work for, Marcus said, genuine warmth creeping into his voice. He understood that security wasn't just about keeping enemies out, it was about protecting the people inside. The systems I designed for him prioritized human safety over asset protection, which was revolutionary thinking at the time. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Elizabeth studied his face, seeing past the janitor's uniform to the brilliant engineer underneath. What happened to your company? The official records show bankruptcy and closure, but no details about the circumstances. Marcus's expression darkened again, old anger and betrayal surfacing. The Pentagon happened. In 2010, they decided that having a court-martialed officer working on classified projects was bad optics. Didn't matter that I'd been cleared for the work, didn't matter that my designs were saving lives. Some bureaucrat decided that my presence was incompatible with military values. They pressured your clients to drop your contracts, threatened to review security clearances for anyone who employed me. In the defense industry, that's a death sentence. Within 6 months, every major contractor had terminated our agreements. The smaller companies couldn't afford to risk their Pentagon relationships over one consultant, no matter how good his work was. Elizabeth felt a cold fury building in her chest. She'd seen this kind of institutional bullying before, had watched good people destroyed by systems that prioritized politics over performance. And your partner? Marcus's voice became quiet, heavy with grief. David took it hard. He'd invested everything in the company, had mortgaged his house to fund our research and development. When the contracts dried up, we were facing millions in lawsuits from investors and creditors. David, he couldn't handle the failure, the guilt. He drove his car off a bridge outside Baltimore on a rainy Tuesday morning in March. The weight of loss settled over the table like a physical presence. Elizabeth understood now why Marcus had ended up cleaning offices, not just because his career had been destroyed, but because his spirit had been broken by watching his friend die for the crime of believing in him. "Your wife left you?" Sarah was a military spouse. She understood service and sacrifice, but she couldn't understand why I'd thrown away everything we'd built for the sake of children we'd never met. The court-martial, the bankruptcy, David's suicide. It was too much. She took our daughter Emma and moved to her sister's place in Oregon. I haven't seen either of them in 12 years. Elizabeth found herself fighting back tears, overwhelmed by the scope of what one good man had lost for making one moral choice. How old was Emma when they left? 8, Marcus said softly. Same age as some of those kids in Kandahar. She used to help me work on puzzles and mechanical problems, had this incredible intuitive understanding of how things fit together. She would have made a brilliant engineer. His voice cracked slightly. Now she's 20 and doesn't return my phone calls. The silence that followed was profound, filled with the weight of 15 years of separation and regret. Elizabeth understood that she was seeing the real cost of Marcus's heroism, not just his own destroyed career, but the collateral damage to everyone who'd loved and depended on him. "Mr. Chen," she said carefully, "what if I told you that some of the systems you designed for my father's company are still the foundation for our most critical Pentagon contracts? What if I told you that your innovations have been saving American lives for the past 15 years, that your work has been far more valuable than you know?" Marcus looked up at her with surprise. "I figured all of that would have been replaced by newer technology. The core architecture is still sound, better than sound. It's revolutionary. We've built improvements on top of your original designs, but the fundamental principles you established are still protecting military communications around the world." Elizabeth leaned forward. "Mr. Chen, I don't think you understand how much your work has mattered." For the first time since she'd met him, Marcus's carefully controlled composure began to crack. 15 years of being told he was worthless, of being treated as if his knowledge and experience meant nothing, had convinced him that his contribution to the world had ended with his court-martial. The idea that his innovations had continued to serve and protect was almost too much to absorb. "I had no idea," he whispered. Elizabeth reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "There's something else you should know. 3 years ago, Congress passed the Military Justice Reform Act. It created a pathway for veterans who were court-martialed under questionable circumstances to have their cases reviewed and potentially overturned. Your situation, choosing to save civilian lives over following protocol, is exactly the kind of case the review board was designed to address." Marcus stared at her, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that what happened to you was wrong, Mr. Chen. Not just unfair, legally and morally wrong. And there might be a way to fix it." Before Marcus could respond, Elizabeth's phone buzzed with an urgent message. She glanced at the screen, and her expression darkened. "We have a problem. General Morrison isn't taking his dismissal well. He's calling emergency meetings with Pentagon procurement, claiming that Whitmore Defense has been compromised by security risks." Marcus felt the familiar weight of inevitability settling on his shoulders. "He's going after you because of me. He's going after me because he's a vindictive man who can't accept being proven wrong." Elizabeth's voice hardened with determination. "But he's also making a tactical error. Morrison thinks he can intimidate me the same way the system intimidated you 15 years ago. He's about to learn that I'm not nearly as easy to destroy." She stood up from the table, her business persona snapping back into place. "Mr. Chen, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Would you be willing to work with me to not only clear your name, but to expose the systemic corruption that destroyed your career in the first place?" Marcus looked at her with growing understanding. Elizabeth Whitmore wasn't just offering him redemption, she was offering him the chance to fight back against the forces that had crushed him. After 15 years of invisible servitude, the idea of standing up and asserting his worth was both terrifying and exhilarating. "What did you have in mind?" Elizabeth smiled, and for the first time he saw the steel beneath her professional courtesy. Morrison's going to try to convince the Pentagon that my company is a security risk because we employ you. He'll argue that anyone associated with Chen Brandt Security Solutions is inherently untrustworthy. She paused, letting the implications sink in. What he doesn't know is that you're not just associated with our current security systems. You designed them. And if he wants to question your credibility, we're going to make him do it publicly, in front of people who understand exactly how valuable your contributions have been. Marcus felt something awakening inside him that had been dormant for 15 years. Not just hope, but anger. Righteous anger at a system that had punished him for saving children, that had destroyed good people like David Brandt, that continued to operate on the assumption that moral courage was less important than institutional loyalty. What would you need from me? First, we're going to file an appeal with the Military Justice Review Board to have your court-martial overturned. I have lawyers who specialize in these cases, and your situation is exactly what the reform legislation was designed to address. Elizabeth began pacing, her mind working through the strategic implications. Second, we're going to document every innovation you've contributed to military security over the past 20 years. Not just your work for my father's company, but everything. Your service record, your consulting projects, the lives your systems have saved. She stopped pacing and faced him directly. Third, we're going to invite General Morrison to publicly debate the value of your contributions to military security. He wants to question your credibility? Fine. Let him do it in front of Pentagon procurement officers, defense industry executives, and military engineers who have been using your innovations for the past 15 years. Marcus felt his pulse quickening, a mixture of excitement and terror at the prospect of stepping back into the world that had destroyed him. Elizabeth, Ms. Whitmore, you understand what you're risking. If this goes wrong, if Morrison manages to discredit me publicly, it won't just hurt me. It'll damage your company, your Pentagon relationships, everything you've built. Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. Mr. Chen, 15 years ago you risked everything to save 63 children you'd never met. I think I can manage to risk my business reputation to save one man who deserves justice. The comparison struck him like a physical blow, the recognition that someone finally understood the moral calculus that had driven his impossible choice in Kandahar. For 15 years, he'd carried the burden of believing that his sacrifice had been meaningless, that the system's judgment of his actions had been correct. But Elizabeth saw something different, not a reckless soldier who had violated orders, but a moral actor who had chosen human life over institutional protocol. There's something else you should know, Elizabeth continued. Yesterday, before Morrison's demonstration, I received a call from the Pentagon. They're reviewing all defense contractor security clearances as part of a broader audit. If Morrison succeeds in discrediting you, it won't just affect your reputation. It could invalidate every security system you've ever worked on. Military installations around the world could lose their encryption protocols. Battlefield communication networks could be compromised. The scope of the potential damage is enormous. Marcus felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. But this time, it was different. Instead of feeling crushed by the potential consequences of his actions, he felt energized by the possibility of protecting the systems and people who depended on his work. What's our first step? Elizabeth's smile was fierce with anticipation. We're going to start by paying a visit to someone who knew your work before it was politically inconvenient. Admiral Rebecca Torres, current head of Pentagon procurement. She was a Navy lieutenant 15 years ago serving in Afghanistan when your battlefield communication systems saved her unit from an ambush outside Helmand Province. Marcus's eyes widened with recognition. Torres, I remember her. Brilliant tactical mind, completely fearless under fire. She sent me a commendation after that operation. She's Admiral Torres now, and she's been fighting military procurement corruption for the past 5 years. If anyone will listen to the truth about what happened to you, it's her. Elizabeth gathered her files, her energy focused and determined. Mr. Chen, I want you to understand something. What we're about to do isn't charity, and it isn't sympathy. You're one of the most brilliant security engineers in military history, and your knowledge and experience are exactly what this country needs right now. I'm not offering you a chance at redemption. I'm asking you to help me save American lives." Marcus stood slowly, feeling something fundamental shifting in his understanding of himself and his place in the world. For 15 years, he'd defined himself by his failures, by the things he'd lost and the mistakes he'd made. But Elizabeth saw him differently, not as a broken man seeking charity, but as a valuable professional whose contributions mattered. "Ms. Whitmore," he said quietly, "I spent 15 years learning how to be invisible, how to work in the shadows without attracting attention. I'm not sure I remember how to be the kind of person who stands up in public and fights." Elizabeth reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder, her touch conveying both strength and compassion. "Mr. Chen, you never stopped being that person. You just convinced yourself that you weren't worth fighting for." She paused, her voice becoming gentle but firm. "Those children in Kandahar are alive today because you chose to fight for them when no one else would. Now, I'm asking you to fight for yourself." As they walked toward the elevator together, Marcus caught his reflection in the polished elevator doors. For a moment, he didn't see the tired maintenance worker in the gray uniform. Instead, he saw Captain Marcus Chen, EOD specialist, the man who had crawled through a building full of explosives to save 63 children he'd never met. The man he had never stopped being. The elevator doors opened, and Elizabeth gestured for him to enter first. "Mr. Chen, there's one more thing you should know. This afternoon, after Morrison's humiliation in the boardroom, 3 other defense contractors called to schedule meetings. They want to discuss security consulting contracts." She smiled as the elevator began its descent. "It seems that word of your capabilities is spreading faster than Morrison's attempts to discredit you." Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years, the sense that his future held possibilities beyond mere survival. "What kind of contracts?" "The kind that could make you a very wealthy man, if money is what matters to you." Elizabeth's expression became serious. "But more importantly, they're the kind of contracts that could put your innovations back where they belong, protecting American soldiers and saving American lives." As the elevator reached the ground floor, Marcus realized that his days of emptiness and invisibility were ending. The lockbox in Morrison's briefcase had contained more than military documents. It had contained the key to reclaiming everything he'd lost and perhaps building something even better from the ruins of his old life. The doors opened, and Elizabeth stepped out first, turning back to face him. "Mr. Chen, are you ready to stop being a janitor and start being an engineer again?" Marcus straightened his shoulders, feeling 15 years of shame and defeat falling away like an old coat he no longer needed. "Ma'am, I think I've been ready for longer than I realized." They walked through the lobby together, past the conference room where Morrison had been humiliated just hours before. The lockbox still sat on the table, its secrets revealed, its purpose served. But Marcus understood now that opening it had been more than a demonstration of technical skill. It had been the first step toward reclaiming his identity and his worth. Tomorrow, he would begin the fight to clear his name and expose the corruption that had destroyed his career. Tomorrow, he would start rebuilding relationships with the daughter who no longer returned his calls and the professional community that had written him off. Tomorrow, he would step back into the world as Captain Marcus Chen, security engineer, moral actor, protector of the innocent. But today, for the first time in 15 years, Marcus Chen walked through the world as a man who knew his own value. The phone call came at 5:30 in the morning, 3 days after Marcus had opened Morrison's lockbox. Elizabeth's voice was tense but controlled as she delivered the news that would change everything. "They raided your apartment," she said without preamble. "FBI citing national security concerns. They're claiming you've been in possession of classified materials without proper clearance." Marcus sat up in his narrow bed, the shabby studio apartment suddenly feeling like a trap closing around him. Through the thin walls, he could hear his neighbor's television broadcasting the morning news, oblivious to the fact that his life was once again being systematically destroyed. "Morrison," he said simply. "Morrison," Elizabeth confirmed. "He's filed formal complaints with the Pentagon, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security. He's claiming that your access to Whitmore defense security systems represents a clear and present danger to national security, that anyone court-martialed for insubordination shouldn't have clearance to work on classified projects. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of institutional power bearing down on him. 15 years ago, the military had destroyed his career through official channels, using courts-martial and administrative procedures to eliminate him quietly and efficiently. Now, Morrison was using the same playbook, leveraging federal agencies and national security concerns to finish what the Army had started. What's their evidence? They don't need evidence, Marcus. They just need suspicion and bureaucratic momentum. Elizabeth's voice carried the frustrated anger of someone who understood how the system worked. Morrison has convinced them that your mere presence at Whitmore Defense represents a security breach. They're not investigating a crime. They're creating one. Marcus walked to his single window, looking out at the gray dawn over the city. In the distance, he could see the Whitmore Defense Building, where just 3 days ago he'd been an invisible janitor. Now he was a federal target, his face probably already circulating through law enforcement databases as a person of interest in matters of national security. There's more, Elizabeth continued. They've frozen my company's Pentagon contracts pending a full security review. $47 million in active projects, suddenly on hold while they investigate whether Whitmore Defense has been compromised by employing you. The scope of Morrison's counterattack was breathtaking in its viciousness. He wasn't just targeting Marcus, he was destroying Elizabeth's company, threatening the livelihoods of hundreds of employees, potentially compromising military security systems that protected American soldiers around the world. All because his pride couldn't tolerate being beaten by a janitor. Elizabeth, you have to distance yourself from me. Fire me, denounce me publicly, whatever it takes to protect your business and your people. Morrison wins if he destroys both of us. Absolutely not. Her voice carried steel resolve. Marcus, I've spent the last 3 days documenting every innovation you've contributed to military security over the past 20 years. The systems you designed have saved thousands of lives, prevented countless security breaches, given American forces tactical advantages that have shaped the outcome of entire operations. Morrison thinks he can erase that record by filing federal complaints. He's about to learn how wrong he is. Despite the gravity of the situation, Marcus found himself smiling at her fierce determination. Elizabeth Whitmore possessed the kind of moral courage that he'd lost somewhere in 15 years of shame and defeat. She was willing to risk everything she'd built to fight for what was right, even when the smart business decision would be to abandon him and save herself. What do you have in mind? Admiral Rebecca Torres agreed to meet with us this morning. She's reviewed your complete military record, including classified operation reports that Morrison doesn't have access to. What she found there is going to change everything. 2 hours later, Marcus found himself walking through the corridors of the Pentagon for the first time in 15 years. The familiar blend of military efficiency and bureaucratic grandeur brought back memories of briefings and strategy sessions from his days as Captain Chen, when his clearance level had given him access to the highest levels of military planning. Now he was here as a suspected security threat, escorted by Elizabeth and her legal team to a meeting that would determine not just his fate, but the future of military security systems that protected American forces around the world. Admiral Rebecca Torres received them in a conference room overlooking the Potomac River, her presence commanding immediate respect from everyone present. At 45, she carried herself with the confident bearing of someone who had earned their authority through competence and courage rather than political maneuvering. Her dark hair was streaked with premature silver, and her brown eyes held the sharp intelligence of a tactical mind that had been tested under fire. "Captain Chen," she said, standing as they entered the room. "It's been a long time." Marcus straightened instinctively, muscle memory from his military days taking over. "Admiral Torres, ma'am, thank you for agreeing to see us." Torres gestured for everyone to sit, then opened a thick file folder on the table before her. "I've been reviewing your service record, Captain, not just the court-martial proceedings, but the classified operation reports from your time in Afghanistan. What I found there is illuminating." She pulled out a series of documents, each bearing various classification stamps and official seals. Operation Sandstorm, September 2007. Your battlefield communication network enabled a joint task force to coordinate a cheap, successful hostage rescue that saved 14 American contractors from Taliban captivity. Operation Nightfall, December 2007. Your security protocols prevented enemy forces from intercepting strategic planning communications for a major offensive operation. Operation Daybreak, February 2008. Your encryption innovations protected supply convoy routes that kept forward operating bases supplied during a 3-month siege. Marcus felt something stirring in his chest that had been dormant for 15 years. Pride. Not the hollow pride of ego, but the deep satisfaction of knowing that his work had mattered, that his innovations had protected American lives in ways he'd never fully understood. And then, Torres continued, her voice hardening, we come to Operation Safe House, March 15, 2008, the school outside Kandahar. The room fell silent as Torres opened another file, this one containing photographs and intelligence reports that Marcus had never seen. What the court-martial proceedings didn't include was the full intelligence picture. Captain Chen, you weren't sent to investigate a suspected IED factory. You were sent to investigate a confirmed Taliban command center that intelligence indicated was being used to plan suicide attacks against American forces. Elizabeth leaned forward, her attention focused entirely on Torres. Are you saying the intelligence was wrong? I'm saying the intelligence was deliberately falsified. Torres's voice carried the weight of 15 years of suppressed anger. The Taliban had infiltrated our local intelligence network. They fed us false information designed to lure an EOD team into a building full of civilians, specifically so they could film American soldiers either killing children or being killed while trying to save them. It was a propaganda operation from the beginning. Marcus felt the room spinning around him as the implications sank in. You're telling me that my unit was sent into a deliberate trap. I'm telling you that every aspect of Operation Safe House was compromised from the moment it was planned. The Taliban knew you were coming. They knew when you'd arrive. And they'd positioned snipers specifically to kill any soldiers who tried to establish overwatch positions. Torres met his eyes directly. Sergeants Rodriguez and Kim didn't die because you made a bad tactical decision, Captain. They died because the mission itself was designed to be unwinnable. The weight of 15 years of guilt began to lift from Marcus's shoulders, replaced by a cold fury at the system that had destroyed him for being the victim of enemy deception. Why wasn't any of this included in the court-martial? Torres's expression darkened. Because admitting that our intelligence had been compromised would have required acknowledging that multiple operations had been based on false information. The Pentagon decided it was easier to court-martial one EOD captain than to admit that enemy agents had been feeding us strategic disinformation for months. Elizabeth's legal training kicked in immediately. Admiral, are you saying that Captain Chen was court-martialed to cover up a broader intelligence failure? I'm saying that Captain Chen saved 63 civilian lives in a situation where any other response would have resulted in either mass civilian casualties or the complete destruction of his unit. His tactical decision-making under impossible circumstances was nothing short of brilliant. Torres leaned back in her chair. And instead of recognizing his heroism, the system destroyed him to protect institutional reputation. Marcus felt something breaking inside him, not his spirit, but the cage of shame and self-doubt that had imprisoned him for 15 years. The children he'd saved hadn't been random casualties of war. They'd been deliberate targets in an enemy propaganda operation. His decision to violate orders hadn't been reckless insubordination. It had been the only moral response to an impossible situation created by enemy manipulation. Admiral, Marcus said quietly, why are you telling us this now? Why didn't this information come out 15 years ago? Torres was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming on the table as she chose her words carefully. Because 15 years ago, I was a Navy lieutenant who had been saved by your battlefield communication systems, but lacked the authority to challenge Army court-martial proceedings. Today, I'm Admiral Torres, head of Pentagon procurement, and General Morrison's attack on your reputation has given me the opening I've needed to set the record straight." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the river where early morning joggers were beginning their daily routines. "Captain Chen, your security innovations have been protecting American forces for the past 2 decades. The crypto locks, the communication networks, the intrusion detection systems, all of it built on foundations you established. Morrison's attempt to discredit you isn't just an attack on your reputation. It's an attack on the security infrastructure that keeps our military operational." Elizabeth pulled out her own files, spreading them across the table. "Admiral, we've documented 43 separate military systems currently in use that are based on Captain Chen's original innovations. If Morrison succeeds in having his security clearance permanently revoked, the Pentagon will have to replace billions of dollars worth of equipment and retrain thousands of personnel on new systems." Torres turned back to face them, her expression grim. "Which is exactly what Morrison is counting on. His company, Morrison Security Solutions, holds patents on alternative systems that would be the logical replacement for anything designed by Chen Brandt Security Solutions. If he can eliminate Marcus's credibility, he stands to gain contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars." The scope of Morrison's corruption was staggering. He wasn't just seeking revenge for his humiliation in Elizabeth's boardroom. He was orchestrating a systematic campaign to destroy Marcus's reputation, specifically so he could profit from the resulting chaos. It was corruption on a scale that threatened military readiness and soldier safety for the sake of corporate profits. "What can we do?" Elizabeth asked. Torres smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. "We're going to do exactly what Morrison doesn't expect. Instead of trying to defend Captain Chen's reputation in bureaucratic proceedings, we're going to put his expertise on public display. Tomorrow morning, the Pentagon is hosting a demonstration of next-generation military security systems for Congressional Defense Appropriations Committee. Morrison will be there, presenting his alternative technologies." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "I'm going to invite Captain Chen to participate as a security consultant, demonstrating the systems he originally designed and explaining their operational advantages over Morrison's proposed alternatives. Let's see how confident the general feels about his technical superiority when he's facing the man whose innovations his patents are trying to replace." Marcus felt his pulse quickening at the prospect of stepping back into his professional role, but also terrified by the risks involved. "Admiral, if this goes wrong, if Morrison manages to discredit me publicly in front of Congress, it won't just hurt me. It'll damage military security and give our enemies propaganda victories they can use for decades." "Captain," Torres said firmly, 15 years ago you risked everything to save children you'd never met. Tomorrow, I'm asking you to risk your reputation to save military systems that protect soldiers you'll never meet. The choice is the same. Do what's right, regardless of personal cost." The parallel struck Marcus like lightning. Once again, he was being asked to choose between personal safety and protecting others, between following safe protocols and doing what his conscience demanded. But this time, he wasn't alone. This time, he had Elizabeth's support, Torres's authority, and 15 years of suppressed knowledge demanding to be heard. "I'll do it," he said simply. Torres nodded with satisfaction. "There's one more thing you should know. This morning, I received a call from Emma Chen Rodriguez in Portland, Oregon. Your daughter. She's been following news coverage of Morrison's attacks on your reputation, and she wanted to know if the Marcus Chen being discussed in defense industry publications was her father." Marcus felt his heart stop. Emma. His little girl, who used to help him solve mechanical puzzles and dream about becoming an engineer, who hadn't spoken to him in 12 years, who'd grown up believing that her father was a failure and a disgrace. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that Captain Marcus Chen was one of the finest officers I'd ever served with, and that she should be proud to be his daughter." Torres's expression softened. "She's flying in tonight. She wants to be there tomorrow when you present your work to Congress." The room went quiet as the emotional weight of the moment settled over everyone present. Marcus had prepared himself to fight for his professional reputation, to clear his name and restore his security clearance. But the possibility of reconciling with Emma, of having her see him as someone worth being proud of, that was a gift he'd never dared to hope for. Elizabeth reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Marcus, are you ready to stop being a victim and start being a hero again?" Marcus straightened in his chair, feeling the weight of Captain's bars that had been stripped from his shoulders 15 years ago. Tomorrow, he would face Morrison and his congressional allies without the protection of official rank or institutional authority. But he would face them as the man who had saved 63 children in Kandahar, who had designed security systems that protected American forces around the world, who had chosen moral courage over personal safety every time the choice arose. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who finally understood his own worth, "I've been ready for longer than anyone realized." The next morning dawned clear and cold over Washington, D.C., as members of Congress gathered in the Pentagon's main briefing auditorium for the defense appropriations demonstration. The room buzzed with the energy of decision-makers preparing to allocate billions of dollars in military contracts, their conversations mixing technical specifications with political calculations. General Morrison sat at the presenters' table, surrounded by displays of his company's latest security innovations. His confidence had returned overnight, buoyed by reports that the FBI investigation into Marcus Chen was proceeding and that several defense contractors had already begun distancing themselves from Whitmore Defense. Today's demonstration would be his triumph, the moment when his technical superiority and Marcus's disgrace would be displayed before the most powerful defense appropriations committee in the world. He didn't notice Marcus Chen enter the auditorium through a side door, dressed not in a janitor's uniform, but in a simple dark suit that somehow conveyed both authority and humility. Beside him walked Elizabeth Whitmore, her presence commanding immediate attention from industry executives who understood that her company's contracts hung in the balance, and behind them, Admiral Torres, whose authority ensured that whatever happened next would carry the full weight of Pentagon procurement decisions. As Marcus took his place at the demonstration table, Morrison's confident expression faltered. "Admiral Torres, what is the meaning of this? I was told this would be a presentation of legitimate security technologies, not a platform for discredited consultants to waste Congress's time." Torres stood at the podium, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. "General Morrison, Captain Chen is here as a Pentagon consultant to provide congressional representatives with expert analysis of the security systems they're being asked to fund. Unless you're concerned that your innovations can't withstand professional scrutiny?" The challenge was unmistakable, and Morrison found himself trapped by his own arrogance. To refuse the comparison would be to admit weakness. To accept it would be to risk public humiliation on a scale that would destroy his reputation permanently. "Very well," Morrison said through gritted teeth. "Let's see what the famous Captain Chen has to say about real-world military security." For the next 2 hours, Marcus systematically demonstrated the security systems he'd designed over the past 20 years, explaining their operational principles to congressional representatives who understood that billions of dollars in appropriations hung on their technical superiority. The crypto locks that had stumped Morrison's lockbox challenge, the communication networks that had saved Admiral Torres's unit in Afghanistan, the intrusion detection protocols that protected forward operating bases around the world. As he spoke, Marcus felt 15 years of shame and self-doubt evaporating. This was who he really was, not a failed soldier or a broken man, but a brilliant engineer whose innovations had shaped modern military security. The congressional representatives leaned forward with genuine interest, asking detailed questions about operational capabilities and strategic applications that demonstrated their respect for his expertise. Morrison's responses became increasingly desperate as the demonstration proceeded. His alternative systems were technically competent, but fundamentally derivative, offering incremental improvements to technologies that Marcus had pioneered. When pressed for specific advantages, Morrison found himself defending patents that were clearly based on innovations Marcus had developed decades earlier. The turning point came when Congressman Bradley Walsh, chairman of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, asked Morrison to demonstrate his company's advanced encryption protocols using the same lockbox that had stumped him in Elizabeth's boardroom. "After all," Walsh said with a slight smile, "if your systems are superior to Captain Chen's innovations, surely you should be able to crack a lock that he opened in minutes." Morrison's face went pale as the lockbox was placed before him. He'd spent the past week having his technical team analyze the mechanism, trying to reverse engineer the solution that Marcus had found so easily. But understanding the solution wasn't the same as having the intuitive grasp of engineering principles that made Marcus's work so effective. For 30 minutes, Morrison struggled with the lockbox while congressional representatives watched with growing impatience. His technical explanations became increasingly convoluted, his confidence dissolving into frustrated anger as the mechanism refused to respond to his efforts. Finally, Marcus stood up. "General Morrison, with your permission, perhaps I could offer a suggestion?" Morrison's face was flushed with humiliation, but he couldn't refuse without appearing even more incompetent. "Please, by all means." Marcus approached the lockbox calmly, his movements precise and economical. As his fingers found the proper sequence, he began to speak, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood not just the mechanism, but the mind that had created it. "The engineer who designed this system wasn't just building a lock," Marcus explained as the internal mechanisms began to respond. "He was creating a test of whether the person trying to open it understood the human cost of warfare. The mathematical sequences aren't random. They're coordinates of concentration camps, dates of mass deportations, ages of children who died in gas chambers." The lockbox opened with its familiar mechanical sigh, but this time the sound seemed to echo with the weight of historical tragedy. Marcus stepped back, his expression solemn. "To open this lock, you don't just need technical knowledge. You need to understand that security systems aren't just about keeping enemies out. They're about protecting innocent people from those who would do them harm. That's the principle that guided every innovation I've contributed to military security for the past 20 years. The auditorium was completely silent as the implications of his words sank in. Morrison's technical competence was irrelevant compared to Marcus's moral understanding of what military security was supposed to accomplish. These weren't just gadgets and patents. They were tools for protecting human life, and their effectiveness depended on being designed by people who understood that responsibility. Congressman Walsh cleared his throat. "Captain Chen, given what we've seen here today, would you be willing to consult for the Pentagon on an ongoing basis? I think it's clear that our military security would benefit from your continued involvement." Marcus looked out at the assembled congressional representatives, defense contractors, and military officials who had witnessed his vindication. Among them, in the back row, he spotted a familiar face. Emma, his daughter, now 20 years old and beautiful in a way that took his breath away. She was crying as she watched him, but her tears were joyful, proud tears of a daughter finally understanding who her father really was. "Congressman Walsh," Marcus replied, his voice steady with conviction. "I've spent 15 years learning that some contributions to national security don't require official recognition or institutional authority. But if the Pentagon believes that my work can continue to protect American lives, then I'm honored to serve in whatever capacity proves most effective." As applause filled the auditorium, Marcus felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of himself and his place in the world. He was no longer a discredited soldier seeking redemption, no longer a maintenance worker invisible to the world around him. He was Captain Marcus Chen, security engineer, protector of the innocent, a man whose moral courage had been tested under the most extreme circumstances and proven unbreakable. General Morrison gathered his materials and left the auditorium without speaking to anyone, his reputation in ruins and his business empire facing federal investigation for fraudulent patent claims. The system that had protected him through decades of corruption had finally turned against him, exposing his moral bankruptcy to the very people he'd tried to manipulate. After the formal session ended, Marcus found himself surrounded by defense contractors offering consulting agreements, congressional representatives requesting briefings on security policy, and military officials expressing gratitude for innovations that had protected their operations for decades. But all of that faded when Emma approached him, her eyes bright with tears of recognition and pride. "Dad," she said quietly, "I've been reading about what you did in Afghanistan, about the children you saved. I never understood." Marcus reached out and embraced his daughter for the first time in 12 years, feeling 15 years of separation and regret melting away in the warmth of her forgiveness. "Emma, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything, for the choices I made, for the pain I caused your mother, for not being the father you deserved." "Dad," Emma said, pulling back to look at him directly, "you saved 63 children. You designed systems that protect thousands of soldiers. You chose to do what was right even when it cost you everything." She smiled through her tears. "You were exactly the father I deserved. I just wasn't old enough to understand it." As they stood together in the Pentagon auditorium where Marcus had finally reclaimed his professional reputation and personal dignity, Elizabeth approached them with a formal document in her hand. "Marcus," she said with a smile, "I have an offer for you. Whitmore Defense Contractors would like to create a new position, Chief Security Innovation Officer. The salary is substantial, the benefits are excellent, and the work involves designing the next generation of military security systems." She paused, her expression becoming serious. "But more importantly, it involves making sure that innovations like yours continue to protect American lives around the world." Marcus looked at the contract, then at Elizabeth, then at Emma, who was watching him with pride and anticipation. For the first time in 15 years, his future held unlimited possibilities, not just professional success, but personal redemption, family, reconciliation, and the chance to serve his country again in the capacity that best utilized his unique talents. "Elizabeth," he said quietly, "I accept, but on one condition." "What's that?" "We establish a scholarship program for military children whose parents have been affected by combat trauma or institutional injustice. Kids like Emma, who deserve to understand that their parents' sacrifices matter, even when the system fails to recognize them." Elizabeth's smile was radiant with approval. "Done. The Marcus Chen Military Family Scholarship Program. I think it has a nice ring to it." As they walked out of the Pentagon together, Marcus, Elizabeth, and Emma, the late afternoon sunlight caught the building's windows and reflected back in thousands of sparkling points of light. Behind them, the lockbox sat forgotten on the demonstration table, its secrets finally revealed, its purpose served. But the real revelation had been Marcus himself, stepping out of 15 years of shadows to reclaim his identity as a man whose moral courage and technical brilliance had always been worth celebrating. The system had tried to break him, had very nearly succeeded, but in the end, truth and justice had proven stronger than corruption and institutional self-interest. That evening, in Elizabeth's apartment overlooking the Potomac River, Marcus sat at the piano she'd bought for therapeutic purposes and began to play, not the melancholy pieces that had sustained him through years of exile, but something new and hopeful. Music that spoke of second chances, of redemption earned through perseverance, of the victory that comes not from defeating enemies, but from refusing to be defeated by them. Emma sat beside him on the piano bench, her engineering student's mind already engaging with the mathematical relationships that underlay musical harmony. Elizabeth listened from across the room, her business brain calculating the strategic advantages of having Marcus's innovations driving her company's growth, but her heart simply enjoying the sound of a family rebuilding itself through music and mutual forgiveness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, congressional hearings about military security policy, design sessions for next-generation protection systems, legal proceedings to permanently clear Marcus's military record. But tonight, in the golden glow of table lamps and the soft sound of piano music, there was only the satisfaction of justice finally served and a future bright with possibility. Marcus Chen had opened more than Morrison's lockbox that day in Elizabeth's boardroom. He'd unlocked the prison of shame and defeat that had held him captive for 15 years, proving that some doors, once opened, lead not just to treasure, but to transformation. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.